morning, everybody. I'm Sean Shea. I am one of the co-founders of FlowRoute, and I'm currently the Chief Product Officer of FlowRoute as well. If you don't know what FlowRoute is, we are a nationwide CLEC. We provide voice, phone numbers, and texting to companies that are managing communications platforms. So today we're going to talk about the new user experience and really the convergence of telecom and APIs. So let's just take a step back and talk a little bit about message growth and kind of what messaging has looked like over the last 5 years or so and kind of the trends here. So the message adoption that we're seeing right now, in 2012, we saw about 14.7 trillion messages that were sent worldwide. Now, this is according to Juniper Research. And they're estimating that in 2017, we're going to see it rise to 28.2 trillion messages that will be sent. Now, this spans SMS, in-app messaging, a number of other platforms in which we'll see messages kind of traverse. But what this is showing here, it's indicating that messaging is still very relevant. It's an industry and it's a communication form that's growing. So we shouldn't see this disappearing anytime soon, but it is transforming very rapidly. The reason why it is successful right now is 99% of all SMSs are actually read by the recipients, and that 90% of these messages are read within the first 3 minutes of receipt. So when we started seeing SMS kind of come out to the market, the very first application was mobile carriers getting their subscribers to message each other. So we were seeing P2P messaging, and then shortly thereafter, we kind of saw this new sort of category come out, which was A2P. It's application to person messaging. Those were the short codes. Those were kind of the marketing campaigns, or if everyone remembers American Idol, I think that's still a TV show that's running right now. You could cast in your votes, and you could actually work with some sort of system in the back end. So this was really the introduction of what it means to kind of dynamically handle messaging data. So things are a little bit more confusing now. We brought in wireline phone numbers in, we brought in toll-free numbers, and we've kind of opened up the floodgates, so to speak. So there's a new categorization, it's called E2P. This is enterprise to person messaging. And we're starting to see this really take off. So for those of you here that have actually adopted messaging and are starting to work with it, with Asterisk, with your different programming languages, running different services, if you're picking up wireline numbers or toll-free numbers, you guys are most likely doing E2P messaging. So this change, this sort of trend, this transition that we're seeing in messaging, this is also occurring in voice as well in a very different way. So let's just talk about voice revenues for a second here. In 2008, in the US, we saw about $100 billion of voice revenues kind of come out from the country. In 2013, that declined down to a little bit over 80 billion messages. So it's just showing a trend that voice revenues are going down, and I don't think this is news to anyone here. But if we were just to take a look at a few other countries, I just kind of cherry-picked Spain here, so we'll take a look at that. It actually dropped below 50, so this is half of what it was in 2008. Now it's crazy to think that that amount of revenue has just disappeared just like that from the market. Then this is a trend that is actually being carried out in all the countries right now. So this is voice revenues. It kind of indicates that things are going down, but voice traffic isn't necessarily going down. So if we start bringing in concepts and platforms and services that are OTT, we can talk about that a little bit here. In 2016, that market looked like it was about $2 billion. It was estimated at $2 billion. It's projected to have a 5x growth in 2021, and we're expected to see this really kind of rise towards around a $10 billion market by 2020. OTT is taking the existing P2P traffic that we're seeing right now, so all the voice revenues and kind of the decline there, those minutes aren't disappearing, they're just simply transitioning to different platforms. And actually, with these OTT applications and services, there's actually an adoption rise that's occurring right now. So I can't talk about voice without talking about WebRTC a little bit here. So a lot of us are really familiar with WebRTC at this point in terms of it being a technology. It's been a nice buzzword for the last 5 years or so. Very misunderstood in a lot of ways, and I think there's a lot of hype around it, but now it's starting to stabilize quite a bit, and we're seeing true applications of WebRTC kind of emerge in the marketplace. WebRTC is taking quite a bit of those minutes as well. So it's no longer kind of traversing through the PSTN, but it can manage in more of the private networks. But there is also WebRTC connections into the PSTN. So in 2016, the WebRTC market was $152 million. And by 2020, we're expecting to see it rise to $4.45 billion. So considering that there's a lot of new adoptions of technologies and kind of ways that voice travels, I want to just kind of talk about the ecosystem of voice and what it looks like today. So at the very bottom here, you'll kind of see that there's infrastructure carriers. These are kind of the household names that we're all familiar with. You have your AT&T, your Verizon. For those of you that are actually working in the SIP world, you're probably very familiar with Level 3. And then a step up, you have your IP carriers, and these are the carriers that are working in terms of bridging the traditional infrastructure network into the IP realm. So Vitality, Level 3, some of these infrastructure carriers are also kind of coming up with their own products to leverage their existing infrastructure. And then recently we've seen the CPaaS market kind of explode. So there's been a lot of movement in this market, in this categorization. And these are companies like Twilio, Plivo, Nexmo, and Zang. And these companies here are taking what are traditional telecom resources, pulling what these IP carriers are offering in terms of a service, and then just abstracting it for developers. So targeting a slightly different target user. The IP service providers are the ones saying, hey, if you're in telecom, come consume our services. The Twilios and the Nexmos are saying, hey, if you're a developer and you actually want to send a call or send a text message in your application or service, come use us. So, I see these layers and I think a little bit and I go, well, it's kind of incomplete because you have a lot of other players out in this marketplace. So you have your unified communications as a service providers, your contact center as a service providers. And so what it kind of looks like right now, I've kind of recategorized this a little bit, is that on the upper left-hand side, you'll see that there's a category called communications as a core. So if you start pulling in your 8x8s, your Ring Centrals, your OnSIPs, the thing that they all share in common is that they're purchasing phone numbers, they're purchasing minutes, they're purchasing texting, and they're also in turn selling these things. So it's core to their business model. They're just offering it in different ways. And each one of these companies have a slightly different flavor in terms of what they're doing here. So I've seen a trend here where OnSIP, for example, came out with like a CPaaS product very recently within this past year. And then if you take a look at Twilio and Plivo, you actually see that they're kind of transitioning over the SIP trunking world. So there's a giant blurring of lines that's occurring right now. On the right-hand side of this, you actually have a category where I'm just labeling this feature required. But I have a few examples of marketplace organizations like Airbnb, Lyft, and Uber. They already have a marketplace. It's not that communications is critical to them delivering what they're offering to their customers, but it's a huge part of the user experience. And then on the far right, I have SaaS organizations. These are companies like Haywire that have actually text-enabling phone numbers, going through the process of getting companies that have Salesforce as a CRM, giving them the kind of the contact center capabilities of messaging out to those contacts that they have inside of their CRM directly. And then you have companies like RevenueWell, which are focused around the medical vertical, super hyper-focused in terms of delivering some sort of service. Their value proposition is very clear. And what they're doing here, they're offering a lot of value-add services into making running kind of your medical practice very simple through their platform, and they'll take care of things like appointment reminders, the coordination, the confirmation that you'll typically see when trying to set up a visit with a doctor. So what's going on right now is APIs are kind of causing a lot of these companies to rethink their business models. It's also allowing a huge group of users to come in that weren't traditionally exposed to telecom, giving them access into telecom resources. So your voice calling, your texting, they're making it very simple for you to integrate. And what we're seeing here is there's a huge API-driven movement. There's also a lot of convergence in this space right now in terms of what you can do. So if we were to take a step back and go, well, if we're looking at the very top level, what is kind of that next tier right on top of those 3 layers? And it's really around the use cases. So these use cases are what companies are trying to incorporate to create a unique user experience for their customer base. And I've kind of just picked out a few here to talk about today. So we'll dive into the first one. So the first one is multi-factor authentication. So I'm sure a lot of you here have set up 2-factor auth or some form of multi-factor authentication in your services. And this is really great in terms of identity management or just authenticating on a different level. So for example, if I were to travel and I pull up my friend's laptop because I forget my laptop from time to time, I try to log into my own Google account and my username and password look great to Google, but they realize, hey, you've never actually browsed from this browser before. So with Google, I've already set up kind of like a phone number that they can either call or text just as an additional vector of authentication, and they'll dispatch something. I get the actual number, type it in, and I'm good to go. So it's fantastic use in terms of that additional vector of authentication. So banks are using it, identity providers are using it, and we're starting to see this actually being incorporated as just something that's a lot more commonplace in a lot of different services, just because fraud and security it's continuing to grow as an issue. So we have appointment reminders as well. It's something that you can actually leverage texting or voice calls to kind of talk with your customers to just kind of remind them of appointment that they may have set up. So if I am setting up a dental appointment, which I hate visiting my dentist, but if I'm setting one up and let's say I'm putting it out there a few months in advance, they'll send me a confirmation in a text saying you've been scheduled for a few months out. And then that same month, I'll get another just a little, hey, you have an appointment coming up, just to kind of acknowledge that it is there. And then a few days prior, they'll send me a confirmation message asking, do I confirm this appointment or not? And this is fantastic. This has actually brought down the number of no-shows significantly in the whole industry. But it's just a very novel use of texting and making it very timely, very contextually relevant. So this can also be used for real-time services like Chili's to go. If you're putting in a food order, you can kind of get your order all set up, and then they'll text you saying your food is ready to go. So you can actually pull up, and then you can text back saying, hey, I'm here, and then they'll come out with your food. The last example that I'm going to talk about is identity masking. This is one of my favorites here. So I briefly mentioned marketplace organizations before, but this is a fantastic way to keep your marketplace and your consumers' identities relatively safe. So you have companies like Uber, Lyft, and Airbnb using this. Just out of curiosity, how many of you here use Uber? Okay, so that's a pretty good amount. So everyone's pretty familiar with the on-demand service component of it. For those of you that were not really paying attention, the phone number that you call if you're trying to call your driver, that's not actually their phone number. It's a proxy phone number that Uber sets up. It's kind of on demand. They have a large pool of phone numbers that they can kind of choose from to establish a session. So this is awesome because if I'm calling an Uber ride and I set my PIN somewhere, my GPS always goes wrong on my phone for some reason. And they think I'm like 4 blocks away. They can pull up, I'm not there, they'll give me a call. And the number they call is actually a proxy phone number as well. So Uber is not really sharing that personal, that information that could compromise my identity. So that phone call gets sent to me, I answer it, get into the car, everything is good. So I get off at my stop, and the driver takes off, and I realize, oh crap, my wallet isn't with me right now. So I can call back to that mass phone number that Uber had set up and get the driver to come back to drop everything off. Now, this is fantastic because Uber also has control over the whole user experience here. They can dictate and determine how long those phone numbers will work, how long that proxy will exist. So if you were to look at Airbnb, which has a very different model around offering people's homes or apartments as places to stay, that transaction time is actually probably extended out. It could be a month or 2 months in advance, right? They'd want that proxy phone number to work for a while, and then after everything's done, they can cut off the communication. Now, cutting off the communication is actually something that's really critical. So if you imagine a dating service offering something like this, where you do want to mask the identities, where you're flirting with somebody, it's going great, and then you realize that, hey, I actually really don't want to talk with the person, or you broke up, you could actually cut off that connection right there, and there's no way for those two parties to communicate again. So what does this really mean in the Asterisk side of things? Like, how do you actually build some of these services? And I'll kind of walk through an example here. And we'll go through kind of a concept that is pretty commonplace here. So we'll just kind of walk through what it looks like to do a follow me. And we're going to do it with texting here. So you can have multiple agents or multiple extensions that are registered with your Asterisk system, and then we'll be transmitting texting through. So this is going to be high level. I don't have any code right now to show you, but I definitely will be at the booth so we can walk through code together later on if anyone would like. But in this example here, we have an inbound text, and it's coming into this 206 phone number. That's a Seattle phone number. And we'll send it, in this example here, we're assuming that you have some sort of a web server that has an exposed webhook. So we'll send it via HTTP to a webhook that you have with Nginx, and then you have a script that'll just handle the inbound messages. You know, your script could be anything as simple as just a simple router in terms of which Asterisk box to send it to, or it could be as complex as actually handling dynamic routing decisions, sending back messages. In this one here, we've kind of chosen something just right in the middle. So in this model here, what we're actually going to do is send a response back to the user, kind of like an IVR system where we're saying, hey, you know, we're trying to contact an agent, and we'll get you connected to someone as soon as possible. So that message is picked up by the message handler. We'll pass it through Asterisk via the ARI, and then we'll make a call just to attempt to send it to an actual extension. And in this model here, the message handler is really looking for some sort of response, whether the agent is confirmed to work with this customer or not. So the first agent, they're out, you know, taking a lunch break. They're not able to respond. And let's say we had a time to live of maybe 30 seconds here. Agent doesn't respond. We get back to the customer by dispatching from the message handler an outbound SMS, which would then say, you know, first agent attempted, could not get back to you. We're going to attempt again. So there's another second agent here that is actually registered in Asterisk, and the message handler will say, okay, attempting agent 2, and then send a message to the ARI. Asterisk will then send it to that actual extension, and then after the confirmation has been received by that agent, you know, we will actually dispatch a message back to the user. And at this point, we've kind of latched the session. So that specific agent at that extension, if they've confirmed, we've kind of, you know, with the message handler said, okay, all forms of communication with this from phone number that we're getting to this specific 206 phone number, we're going to pass it through to this agent. So they communicate until everything's done. So if any of you are interested, we have a developer portal right now that has a number of different use case examples. There's code samples there. A lot of them are written in Python. We just released a .NET SDK. So for any of you that are using .NET, that just came out. Really good resources up there, and then we also have our API documentation as well. So if any of you guys have any questions, I'll also be around for the rest of the show at our booth. We're handing out free cold brew coffee if you text our phone number. We have signs all around, so make sure you get some of that. But that kind of concludes my presentation here. Does anyone have any questions?
We do have a microphone here, so if you have a question, please speak into the mic so we can capture it on video.
So one of the issues that we've seen with service providers that are offering SMS, especially as aggregators, is the inability to do confirmations of SMS deliveries.
DLRs?
Yep.
Okay. Like level 1, level 2?
That's correct.
Okay.
Are you able to support that today?
Yeah, we are.
Nice.
So we'll give level 1 DLRs and level 2 DLRs as well. It's always a little bit of a challenge in the messaging space, right? Like the mobile carriers, the terminating mobile carrier ultimately has control over all that. So what we've actually seen is some of those level 2 DLRs they don't really mean that much. Like the ACK has been received in terms of sending it to their network. They'll say, yeah, we've sent it. But if for some reason you're actually running an application and they've kind of fingerprinted the identity or the content of that message itself, they may just send back a level 2 DLR saying like it's good to go, but when in fact they won't actually transmit it to the mobile handset. So it's kind of a toss-up. For the most part, level 2 DLRs are great to have if you're running an application because you need that data. But at the same time, we've learned that that doesn't actually mean that it's been fully transmitted to it.